Hello, I'm your host, Effie Pilarino, and today I have a special guest on a niche topic. I'd like to welcome Niall Haughey. Welcome, Niall.
Hi, Effie. Thank you. And yeah, an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. And I look forward to answering as many of your questions as possible.
You are one of the people that I'm delighted to meet digitally through LinkedIn.
Yes.
You talk a lot, so to speak, talk on LinkedIn about Agri Fintech, and today we'll have the opportunity to pick your brain and your insights and perspective in this subsector or sector that is a bit of a convergence between two or three areas. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about your background, your journey to where you're at today.
Sure. I started out my career. I actually qualified as a chartered accountant with Deloitte in their financial services team in London. So I think from that experience, I had quite a good insight into financial services, and especially around like 2007, 2008, 2009, when there were a lot of major regulatory changes happening, not only in banking, but in capital markets and various other sectors. After that, I made quite an unusual move. Around that same time, the Payment Services Directive was in the works, and I actually went and set up a payments business specializing in FX and helping small and medium-sized businesses to manage currency risk. So I'd done that for a few years. It was a very competitive market, but thankfully I had a competitor who were actually quite interested in that small corporate book that I had. And then after that, I went back into banking and I was working on a few consultancy projects. But I think, like a lot of people who are entrepreneurial, I was always wondering what was next and looking at different topics. And one topic that kept coming up was a trend that I noticed in India and also in Southern and East Africa. And that trend was enabling financial services with agri-tech platforms. And it was happening in those markets. It was using data, it was using mobile money and payments. And this was one thing that I was just really excited about. So within the space of about 3 months in 2015, I went from working on an interest rate derivative project to working with an agribusiness in Southern Africa. There were a few issues with the business. It was going through a restructuring. It was based in Zimbabwe, but what I got out of it was an insight on the ground to how an agribusiness worked in that type of market and what some of the opportunities were for technology. Because my prediction then was that a lot more financial services would be delivered in that sector using data and agri-tech platforms. And that's pretty much where we are now on a global basis. And that's really what Agri Fintech as a topic is about. It's using that data to build better financial services and in the context of the agri and food sectors.
Interesting. Your journey is definitely not a standard journey. And as you said, once you're bitten by the entrepreneurial bug, it's there and you search in different places. Yeah. So, Niall, when I think of Agri Fintech, I think of a combination of using technology in agriculture, but also fintech, which is about financing projects and ventures in agriculture, but also enabling financial services for that whole ecosystem. But there's another piece that's connected, which is climate. And I wanted to hear from you, first of all, is there a definition of what is falls under the umbrella of AgriFintech, and what are the overlapping pieces that we can think of?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I guess to start with agriculture, there is a huge amount of data in the agriculture sector. I think data, some of the earliest versions that would ever exist in humanity are probably, checking the yield of wheat, maybe in prehistoric nations. And I think that's when people started to collect data in agriculture, and now it's actually everywhere. So if you were to look inside the cab of a John Deere tractor, I mean, it's like Bloomberg terminals everywhere. There's tiny little screens with lines, graphs, lots of data coming out of them. If I were to look then at the financial services impact, I guess the key thing to bear in mind is just the working capital gap. You buy seeds, maybe chemicals, fertilizer to plant now, and then you harvest later and get paid later. So I guess that's the financing implication. Then thirdly, when you start to think about technology and fintech, I actually start to look at what financial services look like from a very basic building block level. So you've got regulation, you've got funding, you've got then technology and products. And I think when you come to products is when you can start to think of things like payments, credit, insurance, risk management tools, and then also some of the data and analytics that support those products. And then finally is distribution. And that's where I look at this sort of embedded finance part of the market, where you have a lot of platforms that aggregate potentially farmers, maybe they aggregate buyers of produce, but they become, in embedded finance world, they become distribution points for products, and also provide some of the data feeds that can build new products. So yeah, that's how I like to look at it, and what fits in there. Yeah.
In terms of thinking of big trends in this sector of AgriFintech, what would you say the big trends are?
Yeah, absolutely. The number one trend is, and the number one reason to ask or to answer the question of why now for AgriFintech is definitely climate. When you look at investment into the climate sector, I think there was a study for 2021, and it said that of $16 billion invested into climate tech, 9 billion of that actually went into the food and agriculture sector. And the reason is that up to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions globally come from the food and ag sector. So first off, like it's got in terms of emissions profile, it has, let's say, a bad reputation. The good side, the benefit is that actually it can reduce those emissions quite a lot. Soil is one of the most efficient ways to actually sequester and suck carbon from the atmosphere, which is obviously a huge part of any, the land assets of any farm. So that's a huge opportunity to develop. But then also there are lots of different opportunities to create renewable energy solutions, for example, that are on farm, or to support other processing in that value chain. And then, of course, when you think of climate, there's also a huge impetus on financial institutions to look at climate risk and transition risk and physical risk within physical farmland. It's quite real. And an easy example is in California, where a lot of banks have exposure to farmland, but one of the key challenges is actually accessing water. And if there's a drought, the question then becomes, how long is this drought going to last? Can someone produce on this piece of land? And if it's going to be sustained over a period of time, what is the value of that as farmland? And that's just a very simple
example.
Simple example, yeah. Then I think also two other trends are just the overall use of data. There is a copious amount of data within the agri-tech sector, and only actually in the last couple of years has it started to get used for data-led scorecards rather than traditional credit approval processes. So that's a huge opportunity for agri fintech businesses to actually start to build those data-led models. And thirdly, then I also look at what's happening in the world of open banking and open finance, because while you've got a lot of these platforms, and as they start to develop their own financial IP or agri financial IP, that will start to become shared, and there's also an opportunity to standardize some of that agri finance data and also get it into the hands of the institutions that can consume open data and open APIs and make decisions.
Very interesting what you say about the opportunity of open finance and how that can lift the entire sector, I guess, on this front. In terms of the interest from investors, venture capitalists, institutional investors, and the funding, can you give us an idea of what has happened over the past couple of years and how this sector is faring compared to the slowdown that other sectors, tech, fintech, and so on, have suffered over the past year, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start off, I'm not going to surprise you by saying this, but it is a small sector. When I started to look at some of the data available, as recently as about 5 years ago, it was about $300 million that was raised in venture capital. So that was tiny. But when it came to 2019 and 2020, that number increased fivefold. And also so did the deal volumes, the number of transactions taking place. In 2021, like everything else in the venture capital world, it had a record year. It raised about $1.6 billion in VC funding for Agri Fintech globally. And that was just across 93 transactions. So quite small. The good news was that in 2022, that momentum actually kept up. There were 104 deals, which was a 10% increase. And the overall dollar volumes, it just fell by 5%. And if I were to compare that to a close family or a close relative of Agri Fintech is Agri Tech, where the overall dollar volume fell 44% year on year. And I think for other sectors such as fintech, those numbers came down quite a bit, about 30%.
Yeah.
So I think
a geographic concentration that one could point to for Agri Fintech?
Again, it's a good question. So I look globally. I think there are three really important markets, and they, for me, are the markets that are driving Agri Fintech and actually will drive it in the next 10 years. And those markets are India, Brazil, and also the US in North America. India they're actually quite different markets. India is quite platform based. So you have a lot of companies they will offer retail solutions, they will offer distribution, they may collect data in terms of satellite imagery, they will provide an end market point to producers or market access, and also provide some of the financial services across that whole value chain. And also what's happening, and that's really interesting in India, is some of those platforms are now starting to specialize in distinct value chains. So one of the very few neobanks in agriculture globally is one in India that builds financial products specifically for dairy, because that's such a huge sector in India. And actually, I think in the next 5 years, that's the way that market will go. It will become more value chain focused and more specific. And you know, again, in terms of embedded finance, that will be one of the best markets or use cases to look at, those specific value chain financial services that are delivered in India. Brazil, on the other hand, is just something completely different. One of my favorite facts of Brazil is that agribusiness is 30% of GDP, but it makes up just 5% of capital markets. And what you have is a really advanced cohort of businesses there, or AgriFintech companies, that are pulling together the data, they're pulling together those distribution points, and they're also building out that capital markets piece to bring more funds into the sector and make that more efficient. And also in Brazil, there is also a neobank which is doing exactly that. So they cite Nubank as their model, where they've got regulated by the local, the financial regulator, and they start to take deposits because they're in it for the long term, and they see that as a huge opportunity. And then finally, in the US, agricultural finance in the US is absolutely huge. There are total assets in agri finance of for about $500-600 billion, and it's a very sophisticated and very evolved market. So building a marketplace is probably not going to work in the US, just because the market, they all know each other. But what has worked are companies that build that digital infrastructure around those physical value chains. So where there are warehouses that collect grains, for example, maybe digitizing that and creating payments along that value chain, that's the way that market will develop. And one good example there is a company called Bushel who've developed a payments product specifically for grains around those grain storage warehouses.
Yeah. And in India, what is the neobank that you were referring to?
Yeah, so they're called DGV, or it's Digi Technologies, I think. Yeah, and some like really good examples in Brazil are also AgroLend. That's the neobank for agriculture in Brazil. And another really good example is a company called Thrive, who are also collecting a lot of data, developing the capital markets sophistication around agriculture. Yeah.
Interesting. So how do you see the future of Agri Fintech going forward? Are you optimistic? In what way do you see it shaping up? You already it was very interesting to hear from you the different approaches in the different regions. So how do you see the future? If you can say, I'm sure it's not one size fits all, right?
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and it's something everybody wants such a precise answer on. And also, looking at what's happened in funding in the last few years, I guess people are curious, like, what do I see in the next 12 months? The short answer is I have no idea. But the way Agri Fintech will go. So I always use the example of Uber. So Uber is obviously the taxi company. It's not involved in agriculture. It's not involved in Agri Fintech. But what Uber did, they worked with a physical value chain that is taxis. And if you think of a taxi company, it had maybe a 30-40 mile radius that it operated around. Where Uber came, they put a digital ecosystem around that, and then Uber could have a lot of the data, the expertise, and really the appetite and incentive to solve those specific financial problems. And actually, that's the way I see AgriFintech developing. In countries like Brazil, in Australia, in Canada, and in the US, those physical value chains are in place, and they are just starting to build out the digital infrastructure that pulls them together. So not trying to disintermediate the existing players, but just build that digital infrastructure. And what I see and what I predict is that in the next 5-10 years, I don't think it will be short term, but there will be a lot more digital specialists in specific value chains, whether that's things like dairy, maybe in livestock, maybe specifically focused on poultry, for example, and also then financial services that work directly with those sectors. So a really good example, there is a bank in the US called Compeer Financial, and their original geographic coverage was across 144 counties in Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And they specialize in agricultural finance. But more recently, they've started to look at digital and what that means, and that 144 county map is actually not as relevant as it used to be, because now they can start to operate across the entire country and work with the digital ecosystems that pop up. And that's a really good example of that starting to take shape.
It's interesting what you say, and we can envision the effect of supply chain management and how this could be one successful use case of data flowing in a frictionless way and embedding financial services across the supply chain with logistics and transportation and everything absolutely connected and flowing seamlessly. And there's definitely no doubt that agriculture is a sector that will not go down in demand. There won't be a demand problem, right?
Yeah, it won't go out of fashion. No, that's for sure.
It won't go out of fashion until, of course, we go to the point where we take a pill, or I don't know, we drink some liquid that nourishes us instead of eating natural products. But that is a long time away, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's enough time to build enough businesses, and before that becomes reality.
And you know, this the other aspect that we didn't touch upon is that AgriFintech is also a part of impact and financial inclusion, right? Because it touches on being able to feed the world and being able to feed the world in a way that is both economically viable, but also distributing food everywhere where it is needed. And I'm sure that will also be part of tech for good application.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I first started to look at projects in Africa, that was definitely one of the things that were top of my mind. Coming from financial services in London to something that was real world problems, real world solutions, and real world impact. Definitely, it resonated quite a lot. And actually, some of the those fintech solutions. So I mentioned developing market access. like that's such an important tool that a lot of people could take for granted, and just providing a matching between buyers and sellers and starting to develop that capacity is it does increase people's income, and it reduces the risk, which is also, you know, just as important. Yeah.
Niall, tell us where people can find you. You have founded the Two Greys, which I guess is focused in this area. Tell us a little bit about that, and you will share with me your links, and I will share it with our audience in the description too.
Yeah, absolutely. So my company is Two Greys. You can find my blog at twogreys.io. It's just behind me if you can see the picture. Yeah, so the company Two Greys work generally with agri-tech companies to develop that financial IP and develop financial products, and also with financial services companies who want to look at data, maybe examine like climate impact and use data for that, and also look at new products interacting with agri-tech platforms as well. Yeah, so, and you can find me on LinkedIn. As I said, my blog is twogreys.io, and probably the easiest one to reach out on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Niall. It was really very insightful.
You're welcome.
Sharing your expertise in this area of fintech. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. You're welcome.